There's still, these pockets and these alleyways where the people really hang. And it makes me think of what we have in San Francisco, right? People love the culture here. They love the diversity. And, certainly there's a lot of fear around what is happening to the city being taken over by tech and by the billionaires. And there's a lot of fear around, folks being displaced. And my novel, In the Lap of the Gods, is a book about displacement, something that my family went through, something that I fictionalized in a part of China that I didn't grow up in, but I certainly visited enough to see firsthand what happened. Anyway, I was a flaming liberal about all this stuff until about last Tuesday. I didn't really be the champion for the underdog. Here I actually work in public education. But last Tuesday, I Googled somebody who had recently invited me to read. And she said, oh, I admire your work. And this artist and dissident, Ai Weiwei, is going to have an exhibit at Alcatraz. So anyway, somehow this woman found me. I didn't know who she was. And then I tried to respond through LinkedIn, and then I tried to connect with her, nothing. So I looked her up, and it turns out that at 20, she became a venture capitalist. And just started funding startups to the tune of like $1.3 million. And thinking, I did the wrong business. Or maybe they can fund authors the way they fund, all these catchy new digital startups. But we write for a reason, and we share stories for a reason. So this is the beginning of the book, so there's not a ton of setup. But this is around the year 2002. And if you don't know how a large dam is built, or any kind of dam, it really stops up a flowing river and turns it into a bathtub, essentially. So this part of the Yangtze River, which I think of as located in the breadbasket of China, has become a large bathtub. And what happens is that the water levels rise, as the dam reservoir fills. And so if you live below the fill line, you gotta go, you have to move. And 1.4 million people have had to leave their homes, entire towns, parts of cities have been displaced. And so my character is kind of an everyman who is not educated, illiterate, and he's had to kind of fend for himself. So he's made a living scavenging in the villages that have been deserted. So I'll read this excerpt. And then if there's time, maybe my son will be the timekeeper, because he's really eager to get on to the next phase, if you know what I mean. But stop me if, I had a little excerpt from a blog I wrote about a Nobel laureate in China. So this is from In the Lap of the Gods. Lu Renfu knew the territory well. He stood on the promontory overlooking the terraced slopes of Emerald Gorge. He had watched the couple darting like little mice between their house and boat. Now the village was completely deserted, and soon it would be submerged by the vast and growing reservoir that crept up the riverbank. Over the past few days, the river had risen more than 40 feet, and the fast-flowing current subsided. The lower villages were no more, having surrendered every remaining brick, stone, and swath of fertile land to the Yangtze's new dam. In the abandoned houses and shacks, Lu would find a forgotten trinket or a salvageable jug. And if he was lucky, he might come across hidden savings, perhaps for a wedding or a flock of goats. The ghost villages were eerily quiet, with residents gone, with pigs and chickens long ago sold. On occasion, he would find a dog wandering around the fields, whimpering. Lu made his way downhill on lanky legs, skirting boulders and shrubs on the slopes, bounding across the level cuts where valleys of spinach and peppers grew in neat rows. If he moved briskly, he would have just enough time to comb the interiors before the water rained in. As he drew closer, he heard a baby's cries. They pierced the fog in shrill gasps. Picking up his pace, Lu turned toward the wooden shed across from the house. He kicked aside a broken shovel and rounded the corner. There the baby lay, crying so fiercely that her face was red and contorted. The makeshift crib rocked from the commotion. A little kid, the scavenger muttered, shaking his head, left for the river bar. He had a sudden urge to light a cigarette, but the river licked his toes. He knew he had little time left. He scooped up the baby bundle and trotted along the path to the house, only 20 paces. The baby squirmed, crying louder. The wind had picked up, rattling his trousers and seeping through the hole in his shirt. He was determined to reach the house before the water did. Near the house, the water had already submerged its base. The front door had been torn out and salvaged, but the frame remained intact. Lou hopped over the threshold, banging his chin against the raised wooden ledge in his haste. Damn, he muttered. Oh, I wasn't supposed to say such a word. He spat into a small heavy on the floor. The baby fell into muffled sobs. Dusk had cast an ominous gloom on the house, whose mud brick walls were crumbling with age. Lou turned toward the adjoining kitchen. The surfaces were blackened with soot. A pile of wood lay stacked against the stove, and wilted vegetables sat on a low counter. A few earthenware dishes remained unwashed. The incoming tide shook Lou out of his reverie. The water had risen over the threshold and covered the floor with a slippery, moving carpet. Lou kicked away twigs and debris, floating on the water's surface, his toes cringing from the cold. He rummaged through his kitchen for anything of value, but all that remained was a broken table and an odd assortment of items: work gloves, soiled bottles, old socks, and slipping windows. Lou sloshed back into the common room, his knapsack still empty. The infant renewed her wails, dousing the shirt with snot and tears. With each spasm, she would cry in ever sharper tones, as if to admonish Lou for trespassing. The encroaching lake had risen to his shins. He glanced at the ramshackle door opposite the entrance. It was risky, he knew, to enter. The water was advancing through the walls, charcoal gray in a dim light. He pressed on, feeling the resistance of the tide against his cloth shoes. He yanked the door open and stepped inside. Here lay two cots, their hard bare surfaces stripped of bedding. Lou cricked his elbow and held the baby's head against his breastbone. It was less a loving gesture than an attempt to muffle the cries. He spied a chest in the far corner. The water tugged at his trousers, but curiosity compelled him forward. Setting the baby down, bent over the chest and wrestled with the lock. He tore at the rusted hinges until the lid gave way. Inside, beneath layers of crumpled fabric, was a lacquered box with gilded letters at the top. He could not read the characters, but one looked auspicious, like the bold red posters hung upside down during New Year's to chase away evil spirits. He stuffed the small box into his knapsack. He grabbed the baby, holding her high against his chest. The lapping sound of the waves had calmed her down, but the new leg was gaining ground. The door to the bedroom slammed shut from the outside. Lou cursed himself, rushed toward the door, clawing wildly at the latch with his free hand. The old door refused to budge. The veins bulged in his arms, sinewy from years of carrying pull. He kicked, then threw his shoulder against the door, but still it would not give. The infant bared her tiny teeth, protesting with furious howls. Fear seized him suddenly, a fleeting image of a body lying prone, embalmed with river slime. Prosperity does no good to a drowning man, he muttered. Lou refused to die. He'd lived through too much sorrow to surrender just now. Fate had swept him up with its inevitable tide, had once left him homeless and lifeless. But maybe there were forces even greater than fate. Heaven help me, he cried. So it's the beginning of the book, and he's the protagonist. I thought I'd just share a short little excerpt of the blog I wrote not too long ago. And it's really a tribute to one of my favorite authors. If you haven't read Miao, it's actually a pen name, and it comes from the same part of China that my father's family does. And he became the Nobel laureate that China kind of always wanted, except he actually can tell you, how crazy and terrible and chaotic it's been, in China through fiction, and he hasn't gotten much money for it. So I discovered Mo Yan in reading Big Breasts and Wide Hips. It's a compendium of China's 20th century travails through the Shangguang family and the spoiled Jin Tong, the only son resulting from a tryst with a Swedish priest. Mo Yan pokes fun at his character, aside from his fantastic journey from a teeth-sucking top to adult, to a brief stint as lingerie businessman. It's a story of the hapless individual caught in societal forces well beyond anyone's controls. How he manages to depict schoolyard bullying turned to horrific violence, with a dole of belly-aching humor is beyond the ken of most satirists and writers. Miao explores territory that my own father could not. As a landowning clan, my father's family lived in Shandong until the late 1940s. My grandfather, the youngest of 8 sons, was brutalized by the Communist Party as they conquered their way to winning the hearts of Chinese peasants. Landowners were evil, so their assets and family treasures were fair game. The communists tortured my grandfather, and it got so bad that Grandma, the sweet, gentle woman, thought that poisoning him would be more merciful. But she did have the heart to do it. In the end, all the family property was confiscated, and my father's family fled for their lives to Taiwan. So fiction often provides the crack of freedom in these autocratic societies. But not all artists and writers can get away with Mo Yan's kind of truth-telling, certainly not in China. Something about his physical profile seems to say that you can't touch me. At least not his soul. He has a broad face, rather like a garland bowl, a permanent squint which contributes to the knit of the Chinese slant eyes. In fact, he looks a lot like my grandfather. Mo Yan doesn't look capable of an easygoing smile, but he could probably make you laugh while keeping a straight face. His pen name actually means "don't speak." Mo Yan doesn't care if he's homely. In an age where authors are more intelligent than ever, he writes to help us look at the human condition, not at him. It's a good reminder for the rest of us laboring in relative obscurity, hoping our words to grow wings. So there's probably more than a few writers in the folks here taking the stage tonight. Thank you. Yes. Back with the routine here. So, let me introduce. So we're going to